Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Hi everyone and welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast. I don't know if you're like me, that I had some fishing planned this week with some good friends. The weather's played a part in that, so we were washed off. And like I've said before on these sorts of things, the part of the Grayling fishing, the pace of it's a little bit different. I was due to be going with my friends Warren and Jim. And part of that is sort of sitting around and chewing the fat and talking about stuff in general. My friend Warren, he's been reconditioning, if that's the right term, old pipes. And it seems as though it's fascinating that these things are as close to sort of bamboo rods. And there's there's particular models that are fantastic, and he's been refurbishing those. And I sit down with him and smoke a cigar. Jim's a reformed smoker, and he sort of kind of looks at us, and he doesn't say anything, but sort of watches while we sort of puff away and enjoy those. But that's really, really good fun and a great part of it as well. But I'm hoping everyone's well, and obviously conditions have taken a turn for the worse in the world and the UK, and I hope you're hanging in there okay, and I hope these podcasts help in some small way as well, and get you to the river if you're unable to get there right now. But today my guest is Alex Jardine. He's grown up in and around fishing. From an early age, he's represented England at junior level at fly fishing. He's worked in tackle shops. He has worked at fisheries. He's been a guide. And now he works with fly fishing holiday specialist Aardvark McLeod. He has an intimate knowledge of the industry and of fishing too. And I'm hoping it's that sort of time of year that we've done sort of plenty on alternative species, I guess, with carp and mullet and pike, that, you know, this time of year we're thinking a little bit more about grayling as well. So my hope is to get some tips and hints from him that I hope you all find interesting and of use as well. So I'm going to be hoping to get lots of information from him. But Alex, it's great to have you on the Fly Culture Podcast. How are you doing?
Thanks very much, Pete. It's lovely to join you, and it's been a strange old year. We haven't been able to catch up on the river, even though we've talked about it a couple of times, and that's rather summed up the year. It's been strange, but still doing a fair bit of fishing, and looking forward to the winter grayling.
Great. It's been funny, hasn't it, that I know, like you say, we've been chatting, we've either had not enough water or too much water, and there hasn't been an in between. But while I was preparing for the show, I was remembering a day's fishing. You probably won't remember, but I think it was in April, quite a few years back now. And it was, I think it was Easter as well. And it was absolutely freezing. And we stuck at it, and I was so proud to show you some of my favourite little streams. And we fished the upper Tor and got our backsides kicked.
Yes.
And then we fished the Bray, and we walked all the way up the Bray, and then we hit a magical I remember moments where I couldn't feel my fingers or anything, and then we hit a pool at exactly the right time, and fish were rising everywhere, and it was just worth all of that hardship just for that half hour, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah, it's amazing how those you can beat yourself up for a whole day just for that half hour of magical fishing, and it makes it all seemingly worthwhile.
It was, and it was really interesting, wasn't it, that in Devon, as you well know, the fishing down here, we don't tend to get constant risers all the time, but I kind of remember that olive hatch, and they were just going, weren't they? And the fish were just rising, and it was just meant to be, and it was almost felt, I know it wasn't the case, but it almost felt that it was a reward for our endeavours. Well, that's how I like to spin it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to look at it. Absolutely. And there was some good fish about too.
Yes, there were some nice ones, weren't there? Yeah, it was one of those special days, I have to say. So my hope is to get you back down on the tour and have a go at those salmon as well, because that would be great. Not that I'm any sort of expert, as everyone knows, I got a proper kicking this year, but fingers crossed for next year, and that just keeps me going enough, and I'm already looking forward to it now, I think.
Brilliant. As long as I don't tell my dad I'm chasing salmon, I'll be all right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about your fishing background. And first off, I wanted to congratulate you on the birth of your son. The Jardine fishing dynasty continues.
It does, hopefully. He already had shown a little bit of interest whenever a passing YouTube videos come up, or especially when the fly culture magazines drop in and always point out the pictures to him. It has been a bit of a life changer. It puts everything into a bit of perspective and turn what could be a fairly horrendous year into quite a special year. And my wonderful partner has not restricted my fishing at all, so I've managed to balance both quite nicely this year.
That's good to hear. And it's, I guess if we look at yourself as well, with a surname like Jardine, it was inevitable you would end up as a fly angler as well. Can you remember sort of, you probably can't because I guess you were probably so young, the first time you sort of had a fly rod in your hand and was casting?
To be honest, and I would say a bit tragic, but I can't remember. It's been almost as if I was born into it, and it's been a wonderful journey right from the beginning. I've got pictures of me being held up by my belt because I can barely stand or barely hold myself up on the banks of Diva Springs, being pulled about by some big 7 or 8 pound rainbow that's going mental. And it really continues from there. And I've been so fortunate to fish so often, even from the age of 4, 5, 6 years old, that like you all know, they all begin to merge into one, and it's one big good memory rather than individual lots of happy memories.
Yeah, that's nice. Nicely put. Often when I ask these and when I'm talking to people, I ask them about mentors, but we can clearly skip that part of it. But what's really interesting to me, and I'm going to use a footballing analogy here, that I kind of remember the footballer Johan Cruyff and his son Jordi Cruyff, who went to play over at Man U, and it seemed as though being in his father's, following in his father's footsteps was a little bit more difficult for him. For yourself, though, you are so super relaxed. You do your own thing. You're never bothered by that sort of stuff. I just think that's really cool that you don't feel any sort of pressure when you're out fishing because of your background, I guess.
No, I mean, I'm fortunate in a way that my father and I have quite different personalities. He's obviously an artist, well known for that. The way he does things is in a very creative way. But I'm much more mathematical minded, and everything has to be formulaic. It has to be in an order. And I think just by having that slightly different approach to things means that we've able to forge a road which is incredibly similar on the outside, but actually the nuts and bolts behind it are very different. And rather than try and push back against it, my father is who he is, and it's wonderful to have him there. And the people that he's friends with are mentors. You mentioned them; they're people's idols, and I've been lucky enough to walk with them and learn from them, and utilize that and make it your own, and make the most of a great situation.
It was interesting. The first time I became aware of that, I was fishing with you, and we were fishing for Grayling, and it struck me that I probably needed to fish a Euro style setup, but you just weren't bothered. You set up a duo and thought, right, I'll have some fun with that. And I that to me spoke volumes about your own path. And I thought that was so cool, because I think if, I had a father in that, I'd be worrying that, and I've spoken about it on podcasts before, of just being a guide really, and the pressure I felt that you're supposed to really sort of catch all the fish. And if you and you're supposed to because that's what you do. And if you don't, then you're not any good.
Yeah.
And it became quite a pressure from that point of view. But that's where it was really interesting for me that I saw, and it helped me a lot actually seeing that. So thank you for that. And it was just really refreshing to see that. And it wasn't a motivation, right, I've got to go out there and catch the fish. It was part of a bigger picture, but you weren't bothered by it in the slightest. So yeah, thank you. I thought that was really, really cool.
Well, thank you for saying. I mean, when it's all said and done, obviously a lot of the people who will be reading a magazine, listening to the podcast, they fly fish for the enjoyment of it, and the only person or the only thing you've got to prove yourself to is the fish at the end of it. And if you're happy catching one fish a day, that's not for someone else to judge. That's how you like to fish. And if you don't catch anything, that's not necessarily your fault. You could have gone out on the river this week and it would be flooded, not had a chance of catching anything, but still had one of the best days fishing you could have had just by the enjoyment of being out. So I think it's just a case of getting the right attitude to suit your personality. There's nothing wrong with catching a lot or catching a little, besides you enjoy your time out there.
Yeah. And do you sense a change in people's, it may be driven by lockdown, it may not be, or what we're going through at the moment. Do you sense there is a shift in that a little bit, that people are looking to experience the bigger picture of it all rather than just the end product of it? Are you getting a sense of that?
You get a mix, and I think I suppose my own guiding. I'm sort of in that London catchment where people come from typically, because quite broad sweeping and not definitely all encompassing. You get people from a competitive business background who everything's about catching lots, the biggest, and performance related. And that hasn't really changed too much this year. You still get the people who just want to catch the biggest. So there's not that appreciation that others have. But definitely, each individual is different and they're looking for something different. I'm, as much as it annoys everyone that I fish with, I'm super keen on pointing out any bird life or butterfly that passes by, and some people will just go and fish by themselves, so they don't have to listen to me pointing out the next kingfisher or brimstone butterfly early in the year or so forth. But I think that stems a lot from my early days of competition fishing, and I've done that high intensity fishing, and I've moved on from that stage, and I don't particularly want to go back to it.
It's interesting. I was talking to somebody else who's deeply entrenched within fishing just the other day, actually. And it was interesting. We were saying that fishing, what it means to us, and I obviously include yourself in that, is so much. And do you think that is because that broader area that you're interested in is because, A, you're fortunate enough, as you said, to be out on the river a lot, and so everything that goes as part of that, whereas if somebody's got, as I joke about, a proper job, that their moments on the water are a lot shorter, that they're slightly more focused on other aspect or the main aspect of it. Do you think there's a little bit of that as well, that we're so deeply entrenched in it?
There is definitely. If you can only... I try and fish once a week, which there'll be people listening shouting, saying that I wish I fished that much. And when you do it, you think, if only I could get another day in here or there. But quite often my day is probably like yourself. There'll be 2 or 3 hours on an evening or an afternoon in between other jobs around the house. And but it's just that quick fix. And I think if you do have a normal job, I mean, we're lucky to not have normal jobs. You set aside your fishing day, you put it in the diary, it's in there, and you make your coffee at 5 o'clock in the morning so you can hit the river at first light, and you don't want to leave till last light. And I can see the benefit of both. And if I travel down to Devon or I go up to Wales, that's how I plan my day. So it will be a full day on the water, but on my local clubs, it will just be a case of, I'll just nip out for a couple of hours here and there and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. And that fix, like you say, it sort of keeps you going for a little bit, doesn't it?
Does,
and then until you need another hit, depending on how good or how bad the fishing's been, then you come back for more. And funnily enough, my friend Perry and I made a road trip up onto the chalk streams not so long ago, and we were fishing until it was dark.
Yes.
And I remember when I did have a proper job that's what you did. And I remember being out on the river at 10 o'clock at night, having to make a long, great big journey back home again. But you did it because you wanted to do it. And that was the day of fishing, as it were. So I think perhaps I'm sort of trying to understand my psyche a little bit. And it's interesting speaking to people with a similar sort of background as well, how it affects them and in different ways as well. So really, really interesting. But is it rivers that mainly where your passion lies?
It is. Certainly, as a youngster, it was lakes. They were much more accessible. You didn't require sort of permanent supervision on a lake, whereas on a river, there's far more hazard. So it's better to be with someone when you're younger. But from about the age, I've always fished rivers, but from about the age of 11 or 12, that passion started to really push through. Just about the time when waders would last almost a season before you outgrew them. From there, I've never really looked back. So now I can count on one hand the amount of days I spend on a lake, whereas originally it would have been vice versa.
And what do you think it is for you? Because I'm, as you well know, exactly the same, and I can't put my finger on what it is. But what do you think means that you don't fish lakes as often as you used to? Do you know what it is?
A bit like you can guess at the reasons, and when I do fish a lake, I thoroughly enjoy it. Mm-hmm. I've had a trip down to Wimbleball this year, which was fantastic in the boat, and I like the drifting in a boat element. But I suppose it's the wild, constant changing of a river that you can go to the same place every day of the year and it will be different. Whereas on a lake, that can be true too, but I feel the river offers me more.
Yeah. I think that's probably what it is. And as you say, every day is completely different, and you think you've got a day where everything's gone to plan, go back the next day, and it's completely different. And I think that's one of the big attractions, isn't it? That you're never quite on top of things, and things are continually changing. And of course, at the start of the season down here as well, I guess that the rivers may be affected by big surges of water and can be different. And that little honey hole you thought was there is slightly different. So you've got to relearn it. And I think it's that aspect of it, certainly for me. But it's interesting you mentioned Wimbleball, because it's getting a lot of publicity, rightly so, for the way that it's being managed right now by, I think it's Mark Underwood.
It is, yes.
Which they're doing great job, and it's lovely to see somewhere doing so really, really well and just getting phenomenally great write-ups. But what we're going to do with this is move away from the lakes, and what I was really keen to do was pick your brains about the grayling season as a whole, and then perhaps get an idea of how you're setting up to fish the river on a winter's day. And I guess we want to start with saying there was a time where we would fish. I remember some place, I think on the Wiley, I used to just fish a dry fly through the winter. just for fun, and perhaps sometimes hang a bead off the back and go from there. But more so now, I think when we think about grayling fishing, it's probably more euronymphing, isn't it? We're approaching, and it's a newish relative approach to fishing, and is a very, very good one to have in the armory as well. And what I wanted to do was get a sense of the setups and the flies and how you might approach the water in that sense. But it doesn't mean you'll forsake everything for euronymphing. Do you, as when we fish, still like to fish the duo or just a normal indicator? Do you like to mix things?
Yeah, I mean, I still love fishing the duo. Like that day we had on the winter, it's just a no fuss setup. You know exactly where you stand. You need to keep control, but your control can be a little bit more relaxed than euronymphing. And like you said, you just can't beat a dry fly even in the winter. The reason it's not as popular is your spell of dry fly activity might only be 30 minutes or an hour long on a winter's day. And whilst we can get more relaxed and it doesn't matter about catching, we still do need to catch from time to time just to keep everything ticking over. And that's where more nymphing focused setups take over. And my preferred method, particularly on the short streams, is to sight nymph, whether a Euro setup or not, but just use a single nymph and watch the fish's reaction. That's probably what marginally one below a dry fly, because you're watching everything's unfurling in front of you, and it's incredibly exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely, I'm with you on that. And again, on that day, that's what I was doing, and I really enjoyed it. And I stuck just a normal indicator on, and it was just really, really good fun. And I talk about it sometimes on here, and the casting aspect of it is something I've always really, really enjoyed. And it's just nice to do it. It's fun. I like all of them. They're all good. But sometimes you just feel, I fancy doing this or I fancy doing that. Let's just quickly come on to the duo very quickly before we go on to nymphing. How do you set up your duo? Is it a short dropper on the dry, or do you just hang it off the back, or you vary between?
I've always generally hung it off the back of the hook. So tied traditional New Zealand style. Particularly for it doesn't matter so much for small grayling. Small grayling, like small trout, are incredibly aggressive. When they hit a fly, everybody knows about it. But for a bigger fish, they've perfected the art of feeding, and their movements are incredibly subtle. It will be a fraction to the left, fraction to the right, and if you had your dry fly hanging on a dropper, you just wouldn't even know the fish had taken your fly. And it's not until you fish crystal clear water that you even know that that's happening. And you can point it out to people, and they'll cast. They'll have 10 fish take the fly, and the indicator won't move at all. And if you then work that out onto a river in Devon or a river in Wales where you can't see the fish, if you're catching 1 in every 10 fish that are taking your fly, that's not a great ratio. So I prefer the tying off the bend because it is a little bit more responsive.
Yeah. And it always feels as though if I'm tying it off the bend of the hook, I'm actually more so, not always, but more so fishing the nymph rather than the dry, if that makes sense as well.
Yeah.
And if I think there's a chance, I'll go to the others. But it's fascinating. I think I mentioned on here before that exactly the same. I stood on a chalk stream on a bridge while a friend was fishing New Zealand. I think it was duo or New Zealand. I can't remember now. And I could see the fish taking the fly, and nothing happens. And that's where it segues beautifully into euronymphing, because the subtlety of a take is really amplified, isn't it? And it's pretty difficult not to see those takes, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Definitely fly selection, which I know we'll move on to, is key. But just by using a tighter bit of line, it just makes everything that much more responsive. The chance of missing tates is reduced. There inevitably will be times when they still don't register, but it does help.
Yeah. Tell me about, let's start at the very bottom then, and let's talk about the flies. And first off, are you a 2 or 3, or is that condition dependent and where you're actually fishing as well?
It's completely dependent on the water conditions. So short stream, generally, I'm a 1 fly person, just because the pace is quite uniform and the depth is quite uniform. So you can select a fly that will get you to the depth that you want. And generally, even in the winter, the stretches that I pick to fish will be clear. So the only thing that's working against you is the angle of the sun. So you get a lot of glare on the water. But I will always try and spot the fish rather than follow the indicator if I can. But some days that's not possible. Some areas of the river that's not possible. So there I'll go with 1. Whereas on the Froome and waters that are more susceptible to rain and are carrying a bit of colour, I'll go 2 flies for some, but usually 3 flies. But one of those flies is what I would call a controlling fly, which I think we're going to talk about makeup in a second. And that's all part of that.
And I'll ask you about that controlling fly in a second. But when let's say you're fishing those, let's say our listeners, the majority of them are fishing waters that do not have crystal clarity. So you're going for that 3 fly setup in that. So you've got your controlling fly in there. The other 2 or the 3, will you think about that setup as well? So might you have something with, let's say, an orange tag in it, and then a more drab fly, and then something else? And I know you fish, you have a great shrimp pattern as well. Yeah. How do you approach that? And if you could explain a little bit about the controlling fly as well, please.
So generally, I'll look to have 2 fishing flies. So flies in the areas where they should be catching fish. And that changes. So before Christmas, so October, November, December, that will be a heaviest fly on the point, which is usually either a red tag, an orange tag, and then a lighter shrimp fly on the dropper, usually about 50 centimeters above the point fly. And that will be usually the pink and purple shrimp, which you know quite well. But again, you might have a red tag or a little hare's ear, so different water will change that. Whereas after Christmas, then I'm looking to have 2 flies fishing the same depth, essentially. So that will be 2 heavy flies, 1 on the point, 1 on the dropper. If you're a competitive angler, then you're restrained in how close they can be, so they'll be 50 centimeters apart. But if you're fishing for enjoyment, then you can make those closer together. You can make them 20 or 30 centimeters apart. And if it's coloured water, then you might go quite heavy on the colours. So big red tags, big orange tags. I'll usually always fish a red and an orange tag together, even in clear water. Once you get into January, February, and the fish are moving down into the deeper water.
And it's interesting, isn't it? You mentioned those tag flies as well, because even they'll work in trout season as well, won't they? The trout don't seem to happen too much.
Yes, no, and I mean, obviously the red tag picks up quite often on the trout. It's a well-known trout fly, but generally pink tags and orange tags can be a bit more selective on the grayling if you put them near them. But I find coloured shrimp flies to be the most selective if you want to pick grayling up during the trout season.
Perfect. And there has been a little bit of a trend to go for smaller, heavier flies. Do you subscribe to that sort of 16? And we've had these wide gape jig hooks in size 16 that you can get a bigger bead on. Do you subscribe to that as well?
Yes and no. I'm quite traditional in my bead sizes on the flies. I don't always go for this oversized bead. But my trout nymph bots will range from more or less 14, 16 to 20s, whereas my grayling bots will go from 10 to 16 with the odd 18. So actually the size of grayling fly I'm using is much bigger than the equivalent trout nymphs.
Interesting.
And that's only a relatively recent move to go to much bigger flies for grayling, but it definitely seems to attract them.
That's a great tip. And bead colours. Do you have any thoughts on bead colours? You like a mixture, I guess? I
do. I have a vast range. Silver increasingly became popular in my bots over the last 5 to 6 seasons. Then oranges, coppers still do quite well, but I always say it's a bit of a trout colour. And gold beads, which spent a long time not going in my box, have come full circle again, and I've got a lot more flies using gold beads. And I know a lot of people now don't tie with them because they sort of work on the basis that all fish have seen them. But if no one's tying on gold beads, then no fish are seeing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very fair. I'm like that. If I think that, we'll go the other way. And funnily enough, black beads, are they something you use as well?
Yes, I do. I'm trying to rack my brain now for any black beaded flies. They tend to make a lot of my trout bots, whereas a lot of my grayling flies, beaded flies tend to be the glitzy ones, tend to be the colourful ones. And then if I want something drab, they'll tend to be the shrimp pattern, so with the lead underbodies. So I'm not looking for a dull bead. I'm making up for it by not having a bead at all.
Yeah. So let's go. We've got an idea of flies and how your setup's going to be. You're fishing somewhere for the first time that you've sort of had a look at a little bit, and you're figuring it out. But generally, if you're fishing somewhere that you don't know so well, you've got a Euronymph setup on. How far from your point fly to the indicator do you tend to set? Do you have something in your mind that you'll say, yeah, I think this is, for most situations, most conditions, I can make this work?
Sure. Obviously clarity of the water will vary a lot, but generally first time on a water, I'll start from the indicator and work down. So usually it will be about, we didn't talk about the sacrificial fly before, it will usually be about 12 inches to a sacrificial fly from the indicator, and that will be quite a heavy fly. That will be a 3 or 3.5 mil bead, and that gives you control on a windy day as well. It will help anchor the indicator in place. Then from that 12 inches, it will be about another 3 feet to the next fly, and then another 2 feet to the fly behind that. So you're 6 feet generally would be a standard setup. If you get to deep water, you can let the indicator go underneath the water and have half of it showing. That will give you a bit of extra depth. If it's shallower water, you could obviously raise the indicator up and fish it that way. So you can vary the depth without having to change the tippet length.
Fantastic. Excellent. Let's go up some further then, go up a little bit further. What about indicator? Do you just use the bicolor mono, or is there anything that you use? And if so, how long do you tend to have your indicator?
Sure. I do use the bicolor. It's the easiest thing to get hold of. I do. Some people have it. The airflow running line. It was a braided running line with a a core that was on had a hollow core monofilament, which was perfect for indicator making. And unfortunately, they stopped making it, or it's not available anymore. But I still have enough stash to probably see me out of my lifetime. But keeping it accessible, the bicolor does work. I find even with my relatively good young eyes still, I'm holding on to that fact, I can struggle to see it at times. So usually I'll double it up so it'll be two strands together rather than a single strand. And that does make it more visible. It just helps, particularly on a cold winter's day when you're struggling to concentrate because of minus temperatures.
That's a really good tip, thinking about doubling up. If I'm struggling, what I do is when I use a bicolor and tie it on, or I've been using a whole leader setup, is use some black permanent marker as well in there.
Yes.
And so just within those bicolors as well, so just short little sections, and that's helped me. But I like the idea of doubling up as well.
Yeah,
that's a great idea.
And the other secret one I've got is it's from pole fishing. It's called bristle paint, and it comes in like a tippets pot, and it comes in black, yellow, and red, I think. And you just literally brush it on. So if you want to change quickly, you're struggling to see it, you can just brush a little bit of paint on, and it suddenly sort of springs out against a dark background.
Nice. Yeah. Good tip. I think there's somebody brought something out as well, didn't they? Where it looked like a big lipstick almost in different colours. Yeah, I can't remember what that one's called, but I saw it very briefly. I've not seen it for a little bit. But yeah, those things do, like you say, and you know what it's like when it's freezing cold and your sort of mind's slightly elsewhere as well, but you might miss that one moment. So yes. Yeah, those things are really important, aren't they?
But they are. And I mean, we both fish the Froome, where, as you know, you might only get 3 or 4 taits in a day. So those 3 or 4 all come in the time when you're not paying attention. That's your day done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's move up the line a little bit further then, and the leader, because I sort of am using, as I said, an all-in-one job that has an indicator and a leader in a milky coloured one. But for many years, I just cut back a normal or an old tapered leader that I'd cut too far up it, because for me, that part of it, all I really want is something that's able to turn over the payload. Where are you on this? What are you using, and how do you do that?
So a bit of a mix. If I want a day where I might have to change tactics, I will do what you did. I'll take a 9-foot leader and essentially take off the tippet section until you're almost back at the taper. So 9-foot leader would become about 6 or 7 feet long, and attach that straight to the indicator. And then run it off a Euronymph line, so a low diameter fly line. And that works nicely. The problem is the connection between the leader and the fly line can get caught in the rod rings. But if the fish suddenly start rising, all I have to do is cut off the nymph's entire dry fly on, and it will present at a short to medium range. Whereas if I'm fairly sure I'm not going to see any rising fish all day, then I will go for a much longer leader. I'll actually use a carp shock leader, which is 30 foot long, and it's tapered all the way along, down to a 12-pound tip, and then tie my indicator off there and fish the indicator 2-hand. And then there's no fly line element, and that helps you fish at a longer range when you're fishing nymphs.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting and very, very useful tip as well. And it's worth mentioning, isn't it? Because I have a Euro line on there, but a lot of that comes from the competition scene and having to have that. Yet for years I used, I think it was Hen's leader that was, like you say, 30 foot long.
Yeah.
and did the job fantastic. I'm not fishing competitions, so it doesn't matter. I can do whatever I like. But I felt I wanted to do that because sometimes people say, well, you're not using a fly line and stuff like that, when I was guiding with it and stuff like that. So that was the reason I did it. But that doesn't stop you, if you're not fishing competitions, going down that route, does it? You can just go and...
No. I mean, the flip side is to get the distance, you need to cast either way, whether you've got the Euro line or leader to hand. If you want to fish it at range, you need to have a casting style. So it's not just a case of throwing the nymphs up and letting them come back. You can do that, and it does work. But to get better results, it helps to be able to cast with it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got our terminal tackle, I guess, pretty much organised. Rods, let's come on to rods. What sort of rods are you using? What sort of length? And I guess you're favouring those softer tip dedicated rods, are you?
Yes, yeah. So I moved very early over to 10 feet rods, and it was... it actually had nothing to do with nymph fishing. It was all to do with dry fly fishing. I moved over to 10 feet rods because of fishing in Portugal, where you were fishing dry flies in pocket water, but to super spooky fish that you couldn't get near. And if you had a 7.5 foot rod, which would have been ideal for that same water here, it would have meant that you'd have to get too close to the fish, that they would have been gone by the time you got there. But with a 10-foot rod, you could just flip the fly forward and hold it in position by keeping the rod tip raised and having no line on the water. And then as I moved on to different waters, I adapted. I say I adapted, lots of people did, but I brought that into my duo fishing, my New Zealand style, where you were using a longer rod and controlling the fly by having no line on the water. And that was just the same as you would be doing if you were check nymphing at the time, because there was no French leader, there was no Euro nymph then. It was, you fished a 7, 8, 9 foot leader in total length with a long rod. But the move over to longer leaders allowed you to fish, as I was doing with the dry flies in Portugal or duo fishing, but with a check nymph style setup on the end. So you're able to fish really deep for really long drifts. So you were covering larger sides of water. So definitely a move to longer rods. But weight is key, because you're trying to load a rod, and there's no point having a 10'7" weight because you won't be able to get the flies forward. So on the market, there were only really 4 and 3 weights in a 10-foot length at the time, and now they go all the way down to 1s and all sorts. So, but my standard Grayling rod is a 9.5 foot 2-weight rod that's produced by Guideline, which is called an LPS, which, as you know, I was very lucky to be involved in the design work of.
That must have been really interesting. We'll come on to that. And it's interesting you mentioned 9.5 foot rod as well, because I'm fishing a 9.5 foot rod a lot of the time now, and it just feels I've just got a 10-foot turn up now, which I want to use more as an out and out nymphing rod. But the 9.5 is sort of between the two, but it feels to me, as a river angler who grew up fishing shorter rods, it feels, and not fished 10'7" weights on reservoirs, it feels more familiar to me. And I strung up the 10-footer the other day, and it was lovely. It cast beautifully, but it does feel different to cast comparable. I feel more comfortable with a 9.5 foot rod. It's really, really funny. I don't know why. My nymphing rods are all 10-footers, but I'm trying to explore this. One rod does everything. Is there a rod that will allow me to cast a fly line conventionally, yet also fish nymphs? And I don't know, in your design process, of the rod if that was something you considered, or you went just straight down, we need to think and come up with a nymphing rod that will do that job as a nymphing rod and no more. Is that how you looked at it?
Essentially, we all came together. There were a whole host of us, which involved a couple of us who were dedicated nymph fishers who had a background in it, but then a mixture of anglers from Europe who didn't have that nymphing background. They had a dry fly and a more traditional style of fishing background. And we, from a very early stage, we wanted a rod that anyone could use. So the dedicated nymphing rods, they tend to be so tactic specific that actually they become difficult to use if you've never done the tactic before. And when we took people that were used to casting all the time and gave them styles of rod that were purely nymphing style, they couldn't actually do the method effectively because they couldn't get on with the rod. And as soon as we tweaked the blank a little bit to make it a more traditional dry fly style blank with a soft tip, they were then able to fish nymphs better because they understood the rod a lot more. So in the end, we pretty much designed the perfect dry fly rod that happens to also be the perfect nymphing rod just by changing your leader setup and fly choice.
That's really interesting because the term I used the other day was a Swiss Army knife rod, if that makes sense, that would do everything. And yeah, it's kind of nice to think of something that you can just make those switches. I'm not one. I'm far too clumsy to carry two rods. I'll either forget it, tread on it, or if it's stuffed somewhere, I'm probably going to break it on the tip of a tree or something. So that's part of my process with that to go down that route. But the design thing fascinates me greatly. And was that it's obviously a collaborative process, but is it a long process, or is there a need to try and bring that rod to the marketplace quickly, yet making sure that you've got the rod that you want to bring at that time rather than rushing? And how does that process work?
It is a lengthy process, and whilst the process on that particular rod was sped up, it was still 12 months, 18 months in the making, because you have to, as you will know, but not many people know, you start out with an idea, and then you have to pull the pieces together. You've got to find a blank that works. And the difficulty, there's always one person at the top, the rod designer, who will send you so a 4-piece rod, and you'll have 10 sections arrive, and you mix them up until you find the 4 that work best for you. But you might have 8 people all doing the same process, and the rod designer comes back and he still requires all 10 sections to make the rod to suit all the people he's talking to. So there's a lot of trial and error going on, and you've got to have a starting base, but it's a process that it's worth spending the time on just to get the details right, and details that you wouldn't think take very long are the ones that take the longest. So whether we have a keeper ring, or how many rings do we have, or the shape of the handle, the color of the blank, how it's finished, that type of thing, and it when all's said and done, it actually changes how the rod fishes. You might not think that the varnish on the rod makes any difference, but it will completely change the end product.
Mm. And there must be a huge element of pride when that comes to the marketplace, and you've been a part of that process. It must have been thrilling to see those rods come to the market and see people enjoy them, I guess.
Absolutely. To know that you had a helping hand in putting a rod that honestly is more than fit for the task, and And when we were designing it, one of our key things was to make a rod that was the best it could be for the price that we wanted. And we wanted a price that made it accessible to people looking to try the method for the first time. And in the end, we had a rod that covered all experience levels and at a price that was incredibly competitive.
Cool. That's exciting. Cool. Let's move on to the casting thing, because we've talked about that a little bit. And I generally, over the winter, and certainly the last couple of winters, I've been fishing this funky little stream for Grayling that I'm not going to name, but I've had great days down there with friends as a guest. And I find that I can turn over nymphs just by rotating my wrist really, really easily. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, before we move on to sort of rivercraft and stuff, was casting at distance. Do you have any sort of tips for that people could employ if they want to land their flies a little bit further away?
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone that's ever spent too many hours in the evening reading up on casting books, we'll read about casts such as the Belgium cast or the oval cast, which requires, I'm going to try and do it, bringing the rod plane out to the side and then back over the top. So when you're making the back cast, the flies essentially are going underneath the rod tip, and when you make the forward cast, they go over the top. So when casting 3 nymphs, you're not looking to get a tight loop to break through the wind. You've got, quite possibly on some days, you've got 3 tungsten beads on the end. There's no wind that's going to blow those back towards you. The critical bit is getting the timing right. It's not just a case of lobbing them forward. And it took a bit of getting used to, but one of the things that helps is actually fishing relatively clear water. I don't always fish the flies level to me and down below me because the fish simply aren't there anymore. So quite often I'll try and pick the flies up while they're still upstream of me. And that means that you're already in that casting motion of bringing the flies back, loading the rods, and then placing them forward. And because they're beads, you've got a fraction of a second where everything's timed perfectly and the flies will go where you want them. And either side of that, the cast will go anyone's guess. It will go in the reeds on the left, in the tree on the right. And the best way to practice it is, if you've got a garden or a piece of water, it's actually just to get one heavy fly on a leader and just practice casting it and landing it in the same place over and over again. And it's a really good sort of practice drill to get you in the hand of being incredibly accurate. And you should be able to cast 35, 40 feet with these setups. It's not just a under the rod tip, under your feet type of fishing.
Cool. Great tip. So let's imagine we're on River X. You've not fished there before. I guess for a lot of the time, you're looking to make your flies drift as naturally through the water column as you possibly can. But are there times where you want to slow them down or even speed them up?
Definitely. The river will always be fastest at the surface. So generally your indicator will be slightly slower than surface debris, but that will mean that your flies are still going slightly faster than the current below them. And that's how you want them. And if you're holding the indicator above the water, so it's pointing down, it should always be slightly slanted away from you. So it shouldn't be slanting back towards you, because then you're not in control of your flies. So you always want to try and look to have the indicator slightly slanting away from you. And the only time that changes a little bit is when you get to back eddies or areas of dead water, where the Grayling love to grab around in, particularly a little bit now, but slightly more into next month, when all of the leaves are stuck on the bottom of the river and they're starting to decay. There's lots of food around them. The grayling will hone in on these areas. And if you can just twitch the fly through them, it just helps, rather than just having a static, non-moving fly just hanging in the water. Just by twitching, using really your thumb and forefinger just to move them backwards and forwards, that will get the flies to jig up and down as they go through, and it looks really lifelike. And the grayling can't help themselves. I actually caught a fairly sizable perch doing the same thing last year on the River Isle.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? The manipulation of the flies is another added dimension to this form of fishing, isn't it? That you can jig them in a little way just to induce them in that way. And that brings me nicely on to at the end of the drift. And, I know a few minutes ago that you said that you will not fish. You feel that the fish have gone because you're sort of standing there.
Sure.
My method is to slowly lift.
Yes.
And I know traditionally they've said, right, hit it at the end of the drift or strike at the end of the drift. But I feel I can get better bang for my buck by slowly lifting the flies. If there's someone there, it just makes it an easier hit. But where do you stand on that? What do you tend to do?
It definitely, I think there is an argument to strike at the end. I think it's almost more important if you're fishing downstream from you. Because quite often, once it's down, the flies will be lifting through the water and the fish will lift with them and take, and that strike will just maybe get anything that could be going past. But in front of you, by lifting, you're almost inducing a fish that's followed it to have a go if it's undecided at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And the interesting thing about the slower lift is that, yes, it does on occasion catch me some fish, but sometimes I will bump them as well. And that brings home that setting thing rather than, sometimes I think I'm trying to play it through in my mind while you're talking about it. And I think I slowly lift and then sort of go, but, it's an interesting way to actually approach it. But when do you think about making changes? Do you look at a pool and step into a pool, for example, and think, right, this looks a bit deeper, I need to change? Or will you adjust where you're fishing the rod level, as it were? Or do you immediately or quickly make changes and assess the situation?
Each day is different, which buys me a bit of a get out of jail answer. But when I know the river, I feel that I've got a good selection of flies, so I know that they should be the right flies and fish in the right way. And some days, if I know it's a river that has a lot of grayling, and I might only fish 10 yards, and if I've not had a take, the flies are being changed and I'm changing something. Another river where I know that takes are few and far between, I might wait until I've fished sort of 3 or 4 pools. And if nothing's happened, then it's time to start thinking about what I'm doing, whether that's changing where the flies are or the color. Usually it's the color, the type of fly first, then another couple of pools, then we're starting to look into actual leader makeup. The nice thing I have a feeling in the winter that grayling like particular spots. And for me, that's always medium depth, medium flow, because that's the areas that give you nice clean gravel. Usually you've got an offshoot of current where you've got the dead spot where you need to jig your flies. But if you're fishing water that's about thigh to waist deep, and the flow's fairly steady but not too strong, there should be grayling there. So you're not having to change your leader from an 8-foot pool to a 3-foot pool to then a 6-foot pool. You should always be looking for those similar areas on the waters that you're fishing. So you should have complete belief that you've got the right tactic early on in your day.
So if you're looking for those areas, does that mean you may not fish the head of the pool? Or if obviously, I guess it's dictated, isn't it? If you're picking them up in that sort of water, you think, right, that's the place. But I'm a sucker for fast water and
Yeah.
I love fishing that part of it as well. But will you still fish that, or will you decide, okay, I think this is where the fish are going to be today, and then look for the next spot that's similar? Or will you fish the water, as it were?
It sort of goes back to my competitive days, where you grade water in your head. You have A, B, and C class water, and so if you imagine on a pool, that could be tail, middle, head. You will, all of those pieces of water will hold fish, but if you know that the head of the pool is your prime area for targeting, and you're on a pleasure day, there's no point wasting time. I say wasting time. There's no point spending time on the water that A, you don't enjoy fishing, or B, you don't think offers you much chance. Whereas in a competition, the reason you graded it like that was because you knew that some area everyone would have the same A-class water, and if it's heavily pressured water, the fish also are going to be harder to catch in your favoured bit. So then you're going to your B-class water, your less favourite, but everybody's less favourite. So the fish should, in theory, be a little bit easier. Never say easy, but at least a little bit easier.
Cool. You mentioned about leader there, and something I meant to ask you about as well was tippet. And do you have any thoughts on that? And anything you would suggest diameter-wise or strength-wise? What are your thoughts there?
Sure. Like you, I'm very lucky. I fish with a broad range of people who are incredibly particular about the tippet they select. And I followed in that footsteps a little bit for a short while. And it wasn't actually until I started guiding one particular client of mine who just wanted to catch tippet class record grayling, which it goes completely against anything that I'd ever want to do. But that's what he enjoys doing. And it wasn't until we started catching big grayling on like 6, 8 pound, 10 pound leader that I realized that it doesn't make a huge difference. What the leader diameter does, it does in some cases, granted, but what the leader did make a difference on was how quickly your flies got down and how they fished. And it meant that rather than going to 7 or 8 where we feel that because it's finer, we've got more chance, I'll literally just fish 6 so about 3.5 pounds everywhere, and that's done me really well. What it does mean over someone using 1.5 pound leader is I might have to use a slightly heavier fly to do the same job that they're doing. But it doesn't, the fish don't seem to mind as much, I found.
No, it's very interesting you say that. And I know the podcast guest I had, Peter Hayes and Don Stasica, debunked the thin diameter mono, saying that it doesn't make that much difference. And, I've been fishing 3-4 pound at home and it doesn't seem to make any discernible difference. But I suppose part of it as well, if you want to do it, and if it makes you confidence. And I'm a huge believer in, if you fish confidently, you're probably going to fish better. That's probably right, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, confidence by far outweighs fly choice or anything, tackle setup, anything. If you're confident in what you're doing, you'll have a good day regardless of how many you catch. The only time I found that that tippet does make a difference was in Bosnia, where the water's so clear and the fish see so much. And there wasn't really a way around it. You could go as thin as you liked on tippet and they weren't having it. You actually had to change your approach and fish downstream to them, so they saw no aspect of the leader. And then you can still fish quite heavy. No, I say heavy, your 7 or 6 sets. but because you were presenting the fly in a different manner, you caught the fish.
Yeah. Here's something then, all these great tips that you've given us today, let's say it all happens and you hook a big one.
Yes.
What is your advice for somebody, if it's a sizable grayling, playing it and getting it in?
Lots of advice. Key ones: don't panic, which is so much easier said than done. I mean, I panic, so I can't really expect anyone not to. Don't try and rush them in. Obviously, the longer they're in the river, the more chance you've got of losing them. But similarly, if you try and horse them away from where they want to be, you'll either break them off or pull out of them. They've got quite a soft mouth. So you just have to sort of ride the fight a little bit and stay with them. If they want to go downstream, just follow them. Where it's safe to do so, I would always say keep the line as short as possible and follow the fish, which usually for grayling, because of them liking gravel, you're usually pretty safe wading for a period of time. And what I've noticed, I don't know if you're the same, but with big grayling, they like to jump. They seem to get to about 2 pounds and not jump at all, and then over that they leap, and it's not a nice leap either. There's lots of dorsal fin and tail flapping about, and that can be the time when they come off, because it catches you off guard a little. So yeah, get a big net and stay with the fish as close as possible.
Yeah. I'd love to say I've had as much experience as you with those huge fish, but I haven't. But it's kind of cool hearing. What about side strain and stuff like that, and rod over? Do you take it over to the side to play them?
Yeah, always try and keep them as upstream as possible. With that big dorsal fin, as soon as they take the current, they're going down. And the worst thing you can do is try and get them back up. If they go over the next run and into the next pool, your best bet is to get out of the river and follow them down and try and land them in the next pool. Side strain is key to not letting them go. And one really good way, but making sure you're in the right place on the river to do so, is to actually put the rod tip underneath the water and use that to steer them up or to the area that you want. And that takes away their ability to jump, but also their ability to turn and use the faster surface current to their ability.
Yeah, great tips. We've covered so much here, and you've given me so much, and our listeners so much information. Is there anything I've missed that you would like to throw into the mix that we haven't covered that you'd like to?
I mean, to be honest, with grayling, it's just about spending time on the water. I think, as much as anything, keeping expectations reasonable. If you know you're going to a venue with a lot of grayling, you've got a good chance of catching a lot of fish. If you know you're going to a venue with just a few fish, but a chance of a big one, don't expect the same amount of fish that you were catching at the previous venue. And I suppose just because you're going to a big fish venue doesn't mean the fish you catch is going to be big. But you shouldn't be disappointed with a fish that isn't big either. They've all battled the elements and nature to get to where they are. And particularly any grayling, it's a wild creature. It's done its hard yards even to grow to 3 or 4 inches, let alone 3 or 4 pounds.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're all good, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah, that's great. Well, there's been so much here, and we've been chatting over an hour. about it. I'd heard that you are going to be running a Grayling masterclass, and you've got one coming up. So if our listeners want to try and get hold of you and learn a little bit more, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, yeah. So essentially what we've paraphrased into this hour, we'll be looking at a couple of Grayling masterclasses, one in November and one in December, that will be on the short stream, so on the river test system, and really a chance to look at the methods, the setup, and actually get on the water with them and trial them out. And it's a great chance. It's great being able to tell people over the podcast here about the methods, but until you set them up and trial them, you can't come back and ask those questions. So these masterclasses and the guided days are a great time to ask those questions that you wouldn't ordinarily get answered.
And the cool thing is when you're standing next to somebody as well, the subtlest little thing you're going to spot, and you can help people.
Yeah.
You'll see it quickly and help people with that to help them improve a little bit, I guess.
Absolutely. So I spend a fair number of days teaching every year, and you pick up those little bits. And there's also times when, out of experience, you instinctively do something that you don't always think to pass on because it just doesn't come to your mind. But if someone watches you in that process, they can see it and pick up on it and ask about it.
That's cool. So how can people contact you about that should they want to sign up for it?
So the best way to do it, as I say, there's one in November and one in December. If you either drop me an email to Alex, ALEX, at aardvarkmcleod.com, which is AARDVARKMCLEOD.com, or call our office, and that's 01980 847 389. Then you can join on one of the 2 days. And if the dates don't work, as I say, one-on-one and sort of small group guided days are available too.
Cool. And lastly, because you've given me so much information and really interesting insights into fishing, you also run a Sunday tying video as well on YouTube. Where can people find you on that?
So I started a live stream time video every fortnightly on a Sunday, and that's just on if you go to my YouTube channel, which is YouTube, I think / Alex Jardine fly fishing, and on there you'll find various fly tying streams. And essentially the idea came about, I used to do a lot of the Fly Justice Guild tying evenings, and with this year they've just not been possible to run. So I've taken that style of evening where we look at tying 5 or 6 different flies and focusing on one topic. And this Sunday it will actually be top Grayling flies for the winter. So really fun.
That was a lucky coincidence. Yeah. I genuinely had no idea. So that's really, really cool. Al, we've spoken, as I said, for well over an hour now. You've just been really open with some great information. I've got some stuff from it, and it's been really, really interesting. Last question: are you loving it as much as always?
Always, yeah. And I can't fault fishing. It's a constant that hopefully a flame that will never burn out.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to seeing pictures of your son on the river at some stage as well. So very much look forward to that. I hope we can catch up soon and do some fishing. I'd love to get you back down on the tour again. And I know we've thrown for salmon down there as well in the past, and it would be great to do that again as well. So I'd like to thank you for being a great guest that's packed so much information into an hour and a quarter. So Alex Jardine, thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture Podcast.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Pete, and see you on the river soon.
Thanks very much indeed. Everybody, this has been the Fly Culture Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. As ever, there are lots more podcasts planned, so keep tuned, and I hope you keep enjoying them. Thanks very much for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.